Hi everyone, here's QuickyBaby and welcome back to World of Tanks. And seeing how my last video where I rated every single tier 10 tank in the game did so darn well, 200,000 views in a week, wow, you ladies and gents can't get enough of it, I decided to listen to the Wolferman who suggested that I would do it with all of the tier 8 premiums. So without further ado, I'm going to be using the awesome tier maker website to rate and rank every single tier 8 premium tank in the game. So, ladies and gents, I can tell you this is going to be a long one. I thoroughly recommend you go get yourself some snacks or your favorite drink and kick back and relax. So, I'm going to be ranking all of these vehicles in the following different brackets. Pay to win at the top, self-explanatory vehicles which cost you money that are just clearly better than all of the other vehicles in its class. Tanks which are super competitive, vehicles which are great performers, some decent choices, vehicles that are neither great nor terrible, vehicles that are alright / situational, tanks that I would recommend that you avoid, and also tanks where you pay to lose, tanks where they cost you gold or you've had to invest a lot of time or effort or energy into them in some kind of mission marathon, and then really they probably weren't even worth it in the first place. Alright, so first up, best dressed, it's the infamous Type 59 Tier 8 Chinese Premium Medium Tank, and the first Premium Medium Tank in the game, I believe. Or at least if it wasn't, it was the first ever Chinese tank in the game, and it's very sought after. Everybody gambled lots inside Wargaming's first ever loot boxes 2 years ago now to be able to get this tank. And it's got preferential matchmaking, which means that it never has to deal with any tier 10s. This vehicle can just go everywhere, do everything. It's got solid armor, it's got decent mobility, it's got 7 degrees of gun depression, and while it doesn't have the best gun handling or damage per minute, its 100mm main armament is still solid. If this vehicle didn't have preferential matchmaking, I'd probably be dropping it in the great performers section, but considering it does, it has to go straight into super competitive. This is one of the originals that is still very relevant inside the game. Alright, so next up, let's talk about the WZ-111, a kind of a clone of the WZ-112 that we're going to be talking about in a minute. The WZ-111 is firmly going into the decent choices section for me, and that's because it's just so well-rounded for a heavy tank. It's fast, it's got 390 alpha damage, it definitely doesn't have the best penetration, but if you load the gold, dab that 2 key, you've got 250mm of heat pen, and considering that it has preferential matchmaking, that's really awesome. The tank has enough armor to really bully lower tiered vehicles, and while it's got weak points on top of its turret, they're still fairly tricky to be able to hit. Alright, so now let's take a look at the T34-3. While I personally don't really like this vehicle with its tragic gun handling, again, the preferential matchmaking that this vehicle has, along with all of the Chinese premium medium tanks and heavy tanks inside the game, mean that I could never drop it into the pay to lose section. It's probably going to be in the avoid or the alright situational. I'd say probably alright situational, because 390 alpha damage at tier 8 is still absolutely amazing. And since Wargaming buffed this tank to have the same hull armor as the Type 59, as well as 6.5 degrees of gun depression, I'm going to drop it in the alright situational section. I still think that there are better premium medium tanks out there, which have really knocked it down a few tiers. Alright, so now let's talk about the 112. Now obviously it should probably go wherever the 111 is, right? Wrong. I think that this is actually a great performer compared to the 111 because it has a much better armor layout. The 112's armor is just simply preposterous. Look at it trying to penetrate itself frontally. This lower plate is 140mm thick, and even if you're not angling it at all, it's still 200mm of effective armor. What's really a tier 6 or a tier 7 tank that this preferential matchmaking heavy going to do to that, even if they load the gold? If they aim at the weak points on top, I mean, they're still quite tricky to hit. And with the 6 degrees of gun depression that this tank has, if you're able to ang that upper hull, your vehicle just becomes an absolute lord. It really does. Combine that with 100mm of side armor, a lovely angled mid-hull as well to absorb shells, and this was actually one of the tanks that I used to be able to do some of the hardest tanking missions in the game, to be able to get my Object 260, or even to be able to get the Object 279E. Now, while I think that a new player will still struggle to use this tank efficiently, it's definitely going to be a great performer for an experienced player, and they will notice the advantages that it has over the 111. Alright, so now let's talk about the 59 pattern. There are some things to like about this vehicle, such as the fact that it has a Type 59 hull and it has the turret of an M48. The real problem with this tank is that it possibly has one of the biggest weak points known to man inside the game. And while this can actually allow you to spot your opponents over a ridge line, it's just so darn easy to hit. And trust me, trying to play one of these on a ridge line, you're pretty much just putting yourself at a disadvantage, which is why I'm going to be dropping the Type 59 either in the avoid or probably even in the pay to lose section. Definitely one of the stinkers in the game, and without preferential matchmaking on this tank, I don't even really know what there is to say about it. Next up, let's talk about the WZ-120-1GFT. Yeah, it's quite a mouthful, that name. This vehicle is either going to be in the pay to win section or the super competitive section. It's an absolute god of a tank, it really is. It's able to just whiz around the battlefield way faster than other tank destroyers. Its armor is decent. It's not incredible, but it's still able to bounce about 230 millimeters off the upper hull, which is more than enough to bully tier 6s, 7s, and quite a lot of tier 8s, and even some tier 9s and 10s are going to struggle if it's using some of the 6 degrees of gun depression that it has. The real thing that makes this tank ridiculous is the fact that it has 2,693 damage per minute and it has 310 millimeters of heat penetration. Combine that with an effective traverse speed of about 40 degrees plus on most terrains in the game, and this thing can just keep facing you. It's really hard to be able to flank, and I hate fighting against these things in my medium and light tanks because they're going to put 440 alpha into me, probably on my approach, and then you track them once, but then they're just going to trash your hit points when you try to track them again. An incredibly hard tank to deal with, and definitely going to put it in the super competitive section. Now on to the M41D, the tier 8 Chinese premium light tank, and oh yeah, this one is definitely a horrible tank. Not sure whether to put it in the avoid, probably even in the pay to lose section. It probably is the worst tier 8 premium light tank in the game. It's not because it doesn't have statistics that I enjoy about the tank, like APCR is standard. Incredible gun handling statistics which allow you to keep engaging whether you're moving or fully turning the turret, or even a decent enough damage per minute. The real thing that holds this tank back is the alpha damage. It's 170 and it just doesn't feel right for a large vehicle like this. Can kind of work for an LT432 to still have lower alpha damage, but for this tank without armor, without camo, and with 390 meters view range, it just falls flat on its face. And it's one of those kind of hybrid light tanks that doesn't do its job as a scout well enough and definitely doesn't compete with the medium tanks to justify playing it. Alright, so now on to the Skoda T27, and this vehicle, if it's anything like the Skoda T50, that's probably one of the best tanks tier for tier in the game, should be a great performer, right? Wrong. The problem with this tank is that while it has the same intraclip reload as the tier 9 medium tank, its alpha damage is 240 and its damage per minute is abysmal at 1,565. The problem that the Skoda T27 has is not that it's a garbage premium tank, not that it has some other better Czechoslovakian medium tank in the game, because there are none. The problem with this tank is that there are other better auto-loading and auto-reloading medium tanks that are going to be coming up on the list soon. And accordingly, I'll be putting this in the alright situational section because I still can't fault dealing 720 damage in a medium tank within 3.6 seconds of the first shot. Alright, next up, the first and the only premium wheeled vehicle at tier 8. It is the EBR-75. And while it's close about whether this one wants to drop in at the top at pay to win or the super competitive section, I'd say that if you're not the best of players, and you're not willing to use premium consumables on this tank, and you don't have a crew and you're not planning to have an experienced crew inside the vehicle, it's probably going to either drop in at the great performers or the super competitive section. What really turns this tank up to 10 and into the pay to win section for me is when you have all of those things, when you have situational awareness, brothers in arms, recon, when you're using a premium consumable. You might even want to think about putting some bond equipment on this thing if you're absolutely flush with bonds, as this was my number one pick for front line. It's just so rapid. And when I thought that, well, it doesn't have the best kind of autoloader, only 2 rounds and 175 damage on each of the shells, what I didn't consider is just how efficient and brutal dumping in 2 rounds and some kind of 350 damage burst within 1.5 seconds of the first shot is inside World of Tanks. Combine this with high explosive rounds with 260 alpha and 75 millimeters of penetration, and you've got more than enough to double tap artillery or even to completely obliterate light tanks on the enemy team. It's certainly one of my top picks of any premium tank inside the game, and while it will definitely be better in the hands of a capable player, and trust me, I think this tank, it has one of the highest skill caps inside the game, and you can be crazy influential if you're on top of your game when you're playing this vehicle. You're going to have to do everything that you can to pump up the abysmal 310 meters base view range. Alright, so next up, the Lorraine. A tank so good, it was at tier 8 inside the French tech tree, was moved up to tier 9 and incredibly buffed, then it was removed, and then it was brought back in as a tier 8 premium tank. I'm going to be dropping this tank in between the super competitive and great performers section. Again, depending on your skill level. For me, I'm going to drop it in at the super competitive section. It's definitely one of the vehicles that I would choose to take to front line. How can you suck in a tank that deals 1,200 damage within 7.5 seconds of the first shot with 8 degrees of gun depression, and then has ample mobility with a 60 km/h top speed limit and 23 reverse speed and ample power to wait to be able to get there, to be able to then disengage, save up your shots again, and then re-engage on a different flank. This tank truly is an excellent performer, and it's definitely a tank that I would not want to see on the enemy team in the hands of a capable player. Now, a pseudo-heavy, the French FCM 50T. This thing is neither a heavy tank nor a medium tank, but of course it doesn't have the camo of a medium, but nor does it have the mobility of a heavy. This thing gets around. It's got preferential matchmaking, so it never has to deal with tier 10 tanks, and has 400 meters view range, which makes it quite a nice scout, especially if you put your French heavy tank crews inside it. With recon, situational awareness, and brothers in arms. This is a tricky one. It's again quite a high skill cap tank. I think a great player will get a lot from this tank, but a new player will really struggle in it with its complete lack of armor, in addition with its poor alpha damage. Accordingly, I kind of want to drop this in the great performers or even decent choices for myself, but for a newer player, I'd probably drop it in the alright situational or even decent choices section. So I think we're going to end up in the middle. I think that's the most sensible. Alright, Amx Cdc. When it first went into the game, this tank was absolutely awesome. A vehicle that sacrificed all protection to be able to gain raw firepower, penetration, mobility, and view range. It was an incredibly awesome tank, and I absolutely loved it to pieces. However, since then, more and more tanks have gone into the game that are more and more competitive, and it's definitely made it drop down the tiers a lot. The result is that while you can still do well inside this tank, you're literally putting yourself at a disadvantage compared to other premium vehicles inside the game, especially something like a Lorraine. So I'm going to actually drop this in the avoid section, although I'm not denying that this tank could probably alright and situational as well, but I just couldn't recommend it in the current meta of World of Tanks. Okay, so now the Revelries. This is actually one of my preferred medium tanks. With 10 degrees of gun depression, 390 alpha damage, and whopping shell velocity of 1,400 meters a second, this thing snipes. It's awesome. The things that hold this vehicle back is that it is pretty much a tier 5 hull at tier 8 with a bigger gun, and accordingly, your mobility and your armor are very lackluster, but it makes up for it with its flexibility on a ridgeline, and considering how cheap this tank is, quite often when Wargaming do a 15% discount off all regular tech tree tanks, you can pick this thing up for about 6,500 gold. That means it's going to drop in a decent choices. It's not nearly as expensive as other premium tanks are. And if you can make do with the 200 millimeters of penetration that this vehicle has, and hopefully you can snipe more accurately with the APCR rounds because of it, I think it's a decent tank. Alright, so now let's talk about the Leibert. This is an incredibly solid tier 8 French heavy tank, if you also exclude the one key weakness that the vehicle has, and that is that it has a gigantic weak point on top of the vehicle. Oh, it's horrible. It just stares you right in the face and everybody shoots it. Look at that. Look how beautiful this thing's armor is. The cheeks are angled from the front. Honestly, you can just sit in front of all tier 6 and tier 7 tanks, and if you're using your gun depression and hiding your lower plate on this vehicle, oh, it's absolutely monstrous. It really is. Nothing's going to be able to penetrate it frontally apart from premium rounds from equal tier tanks or higher tier tanks. But, oh, that weak point on top, it would be so good if it didn't have that weak point. Also, the 370 meters view range, while that's not awful, it's definitely not great. And this gun of mediocre aim time and a mediocre rate of fire, but such good penetration, mean that I'm probably going to drop the Leibert in an alright, it's right in between decent choices and alright situation. I think I'll drop it in decent choices. It'll definitely be better in the hands of a newer player than the FCM 50T will, however, so make sure you take that into consideration. I would recommend that advanced players go for the FCM, while beginning players go for the AMX, if you're planning on training up your French heavy tanks. But oh, here comes the boy. It's the Samoa SM, and I really think this thing is so underrated. For some reason, people just can't do well in this tank. And I guess it's because of the mobility of the vehicle. Honestly, this thing is incredible. It's pretty much like a Lorraine that has a better intra-clip reload of 2.25 seconds, so you can dump your magazine out faster than the Lorraine can, and it's also got an extra round. This thing deals 1,500 damage within 9 seconds of the first shot. And considering its armor, which while it's not ever going to hold up against 232mm of penetration that the tank has, it's 200mm of upper hull armor, especially if you angle it like this, are absolutely incredible. The amount of times that I get to just bounce tier 6 and tier 7s and then take their entire hit bar away from them is just really brutal in this tank. Even the turret armor is a little bit tricky for tier 6 and tier 7s to deal with. The only thing that really holds the vehicle back is the mobility. 37 forwards and a 12.5 power to weight ratio doesn't really feel very French, and also 0.4 accuracy and not the best dispersion values in the world, but you're going to be taking vertical stabilizers, probably coated optics and vents on this tank, because as it's an autoloader it can't use a gun rammer, and this is one of my go-to picks for front line for just smashing through my opponents at the end. But I think considering the mobility, I'm probably going to be dropping this one in at the great performer section, as quite often you're having to duke it out with heavies that are just able to punch harder than you are, at least for a one-for-one trade. Next, let's talk about the Amx Cda, and while some people seem to be able to do well in this tank because it does have APCR as standard with 1,500 meters a second shell velocity and decent penetration of 260, combined with 0.3 accuracy and enough armor to be able to ricochet, yeah, I'm going to be dropping this in the avoid section. I really can't stand a tank destroyer that can't destroy tanks, and this thing has 2,000 damage per minute. That's not tank destroyer worthy. There are better, harder hitting and more flexible tank destroyers for you to spend your hard earned cash on, which is why I would drop this in the avoid section. Alright, now we're going to be talking about the smallest tank at tier 8. It's the ELC Even 90. And this tank is a complete troll. It started by trolling me. I thought this vehicle was going to be absolutely tragic, although it would have some situations where it was actually pretty good. Yeah, boy, I was wrong. This tank is actually performing very admirably indeed. And while it's the third most popular premium light tank inside the game, it is also packing the second highest win ratio. And while if you're the kind of player who likes to rush in, deal a ton of damage, I'd probably drop this in the pay to lose or the avoid section. If you're willing to take your time, set up in some bushes, possibly with a full concealment crew and a pair of binoculars, this is probably dropping in the super competitive section. Its clip damage of 660 delivered within 5 seconds of the first shot means that it can punch back when it's been spotted. And while this is definitely not the tank that you're going to be wanting to snipe at people on the move, it's the kind of vehicle that I would never recommend to a new player. But if you're an experienced player of World of Tanks, what this thing is going to be able to do with rewarding, hopefully, your knowledge of bush locations and the most powerful spotting positions on the maps in World of Tanks, yeah, you're going to be able to do a hell of a lot that no other tank at tier 8 is capable of doing if you equip this tank correctly. Next up, the Panther 88, and it's pay to win. Totally pay to win. Oh, wait, no, sorry. Oh, that's not how this works. No, boys and girls, it's pay to lose. That's what this tank is. This tank was so bad that Wargaming actually apologized to people for releasing it because so many people complained about how poor it was. And they allowed people to refund themselves if they didn't enjoy the tank. Since then, it's been tarred with a brush that no manner of micro patches and small buffs to this tank is capable of removing. And even though this tank packs one of the best rates of fire of any 88 or 90mm 240 alpha damage gun in the game of 8.7 rounds a minute, it's just absolutely abysmal. It's a huge hulking tank with bad gun dispersion values, lackluster mobility, and lackluster armor. It doesn't even have any view range to be able to make up for all of the disadvantages that this vehicle has. It truly is one of the worst premium tanks in the game, and I would avoid it with a barge pole. Next up, let's talk about the Conan Yank Panzer. While I actually quite enjoyed playing this tank for a little while, I played this vehicle with a camo net, a gun rammer, and binoculars, and I set it up as some kind of ultra stealthy vehicle that just kept firing and didn't give a monkeys, a kind of reconnaissance vehicle. With its 70 km/h top speed limit and decent power to weight ratio of just under 20 to be able to get there, it didn't make up for it. This tank is definitely going into the pay to lose section, and while I enjoyed playing this tank with a fully decked out crew and try-harding my my pants off. This tank has the worst win ratio of any tier 8 tank destroyer in the game. In fact, it's the only one that dips as low as 45%. That's so bad that it's actually 2% average less than any other tier 8 tank destroyer. It is abysmal. But again, it's hilarious because I've had some of my most fun games inside this tank. Maybe because I enjoy being the underdog, but I'm still going to have to drop it into the pay-to-lose section. Alright, so now let's talk about the Conan Jagdpanzer with the 105mm. Great way for wargaming to fix an abysmal tank, right? Just give it a bigger gun. Well, no, not really. While it definitely helped the vehicle, there's still something incredibly wrong about playing a tank destroyer that doesn't have armor and doesn't have a turret to be able to make up for it. And while there's no doubt in my mind that the Conan Jagdpanzer with 105mm is better than the Conan Jagdpanzer with the 90mm, it's definitely going in one of the avoid sections for me. Onto the Scorpion G, a tank that revolutionized what it meant to be a premium tank. It was fast, it had the highest alpha damage of any premium tank when it first went into the game with 490, and with a fully traversable turret and okay gun depression, this thing is clearly a great performer. This tank's a really interesting one because for a complete beginner, it will do well because a complete beginner can sit at the back, click at things, hopefully when they're stationary, and deal 490 damage. However, for an experienced veteran who has their guerrilla crew at 5 or 6 skills and then they put them in the Scorpion G, suddenly you're making up for the poor camo that the tank has with your full concealment crew. Suddenly you're thinking about trying to hide the terrible armor that the vehicle has by using your mobility and your flexibility with the turret to be able to work a ridgeline. And that's why this tank is probably one of the universal choices for all players out there, both new and experienced. Now on to the Panzer Mutts, and again it came in that same era as the Scorpion G, but unlike the Scorpion G, I don't think it's really stayed in its status of being a great performer. Used to be. Definitely was one of those tanks that had great gun handling, a great all-rounder, and it was probably just a little bit better than all of the other tier 8 medium tanks inside the game. However, since then, the tier 8 medium tanks have kind of got better, while this tank has stayed behind. But more importantly, there have been other premium tanks going into the game that just mean that why would you want to play a Mutts? Accordingly, if you absolutely, utterly have to play a German medium tank, then maybe this one would be the one for you. However, for me personally, there's a lot of other premium medium tanks that I would rather play. Alright, so now on to the Black Dog. The Black Dog is a really interesting one because when it first was in the game, it had tier 9 matchmaking. Then when they changed all of the matchmaking of the light tanks, they didn't change it for all of the premium vehicles. And so the Black Dog now has tier 8 matchmaking, effectively with tier 9 stats. Accordingly, that should mean that the Black Dog will be a great performer, right? However, it kind of suffers for the same reasons that the Chinese Black Dog did earlier in the comparison. That is that it's not really a light tank. It's not really a medium tank. It doesn't have the best camo or the best mobility or the smallest size to be able to avoid the shells. However, you can't really go wrong with 400 meters view range and the fact that this tank has high explosive rounds with 102mm of penetration and 320 alpha damage, and it's got better penetration than some tier 10 light tanks have if you dab the 2 key and load the gold with 250mm of heat. Accordingly, I'd like to drop the Black Dog in the great performer section. However, if you are a veteran light tank player, then I think that this will go more on towards the super competitive section. Alright, now on to the Mauer Brecker, and I'm dropping this in the pay-to-lose section, boys and girls. While this tank has a big gun, 128mm with 440 alpha damage, 400 meters view range, a big old slab of hit points, and it looks like it's got really thick armor, it just has 2 giant weak points. One, a weak point on the front of the vehicle with 145mm of effective armor. Secondly, on top of the tank, 150mm of effective up there. Its cheeks aren't great, and funnily enough, when the enemies do get your side, it doesn't really feel incredible for such a chunky tank and the sacrifices that you have to make to be able to gain that thick armor. This tank would have been a balanced and strong vehicle back in the day when Wargaming still released balanced premium tanks. However, the problem is there are not balanced premium tanks inside the game anymore. That means this tank has to compete with them. This would be a nice little mouse at tier 8, able to deal with tier 6s and tier 7s, but would struggle inside a matchup if it didn't have such a huge weak point on top of the tank, and also if they didn't make the machine gun port such an incredible weakness on the front of the vehicle. Accordingly, I will drop this tank in the pay-to-lose section, as because frankly you could play the VK100-01P inside the regular tech tree, and to all intents and purposes, be a better tank. Alright, so now let's talk about the HWK. So this is a funny one because it's got 410 meters view range at tier 8, as well as a decent gun, mobility, and damage per minute. Again, the thing that holds this tank back is it's a light tank that isn't trying to scout. Do you notice how the super competitive vehicles are light tanks that scout, or light tanks that used to have really good matchmaking? This tank is incredibly chonky, easy to hit, and frankly the advantages that the vehicle should clock up just don't really lead to being advantages. All of these kind of like pseudo-sniping tanks just get held back by the fact that they're not incredibly good scouts. And so accordingly, while I'm going to be dropping this thing in the decent performers section, and you really can't go wrong with the tank, I just think that there are better premium vehicles out there. Alright, so now on to the VK7501K. This tank is a side-scraping behemoth. It's an incredible side-scraper. It's got amazing armor, especially against tier 6, 7s, and 8s. However, it starts to struggle against 9s and 10s. Combine this with the 490 alpha damage that the vehicle has and great premium penetration of 263, and you think that we'd be onto a clear winner with this tank. But really, it's just the mobility that holds this thing back massively. 30 kilometers an hour just doesn't really feel like it's the most meta-worthy tank. Combine that with 5 degrees of gun depression, and now the fact that you've got kind of baby E75s or E50s going into the game, and the VK7501 definitely starts to feel a little bit more lackluster. So I'm going to be dropping this tank in the alright situational section, because if you want to feel like a side-scraping boss, then this will be the vehicle for you. But I don't know about you guys, but I kind of like to also be able to do other things and have like 90% as good side scraping as this tank, but have massively better mobility, for example. Now on to the M48A2 Raumpanzer, which is one of the latest tier 8 premium tanks in the game. And really, this tank completely sucked because it was incredibly similar to the TL1 LPC, aka the Offspring tank, and just really didn't have any advantages. Combine this with a huge weak points on top of the vehicle and sluggish mobility, and it's that kind of tank that tries to be a hybrid. It's a medium tank pretending to be a heavy that just can't do the things that a heavy tank can. And because it tries to do that, it can't do the things that a medium tank needs to be able to do. And while I'm going to put this again in the alright and situational tank, because you will get into matchups where you can just grind through the tier 6s and tier 7s or people who don't shoot at your weak point on top, you're going to be lacking in other scenarios. Alright, so now on to the E75 Ts. This is a vehicle that just went into the game inside Wargaming's loot boxes. And I personally think this thing is great. I think it's either a decent choice or it's a great performer. Probably veering on the decent choices. This thing is incredibly mobile for a heavy tank. 45 kilometers an hour top speed limit with a 16 power to weight ratio. That allows you to ram things for holy moly, considering that the tank weighs 80 tons. The tank also has great space protection over the side, a big fat mantlet, and its turret armor is exceptionally good as well. Your main problem with this vehicle is its lower plate and even its upper plate are not very good. If you load heat rounds and fire them at this tank, they're pretty much going to go in, irrelevant if they hit the upper plate, even when it's angled like that. And so that means that it can be incredibly frustrating to play this vehicle, as you are a big tank that is hard to hide. Nevertheless, if you use this mobility to your advantage, you should still do darn well in the E75 Ts. Alright, so now on to the Lerva, and I'm going to be dropping this tank in the very same position. Now, the Lerva probably used to be one of the biggest EXP pinatas on the game. You'd see one of the tanks on the enemy team and you'd absolutely love it because you could just shoot all over the front plate. You just nom it up, and also it would have bad damage per minute to be able to shoot back at you. And while the Lerva's damage per minute is still not good, it's 1600 base, it's got more than enough penetration and accuracy to be able to consistently deal damage back to you. And now that Wargaming have massively buffed the armor of this vehicle, it's definitely one that you should probably go and take a look at in your garage if you haven't played it in a while. Now on to the Yank Tiger 88. Well, you take a Yank Tiger's armor from tier 9, drop it down to tier 8 and give it preferential matchmaking so it never has to meet any tier 10 tanks. Should be great, right? Wrong. Even though Wargaming just constantly kept buffing this tank again and again and again and again, it just really never took off. This vehicle is a one-trick pony, boys and girls, and that is having 2,823 base damage per minute. It has a ludicrous rate of fire, 11.76. But it still doesn't make up for the fact that the Yank Tiger armor model is just not great. Its upper hull is pretty poor outside of meeting those tier 6 and tier 7 tanks, and everybody just loads the gold and shoots through the mantlet of the vehicle. Sure, you're going to have some situations where a bunch of Muppets sit in front of you and you can farm them all one by one by one, but people are starting to get a little bit better in World of Tanks after 8 years. Well, you'd hope so. You shouldn't have to depend on only being able to farm the weaker players and the weaker tanks on the enemy team, when you can go and have a turret, higher alpha damage, and even higher penetration to go to boot. Oh my lord, this shouldn't have made it into this tier list. This is the Panzer Panther. It used to be a tier 7 tech tree German light tank that Wargaming removed from the game, and they've been playtesting it at tier 8 premium light tank, but they won't let me get my hands on it. Oh my lord, it's a frustrating thing for me. I'm going to have to throw this thing at pay to win. No, honestly, this thing was probably pay to lose back in the day, which is why Wargaming have no idea quite what they want to do with it. Although, I should think, maybe we'll get this back in the game as some kind of well-deserved reward for 2020. We'll have to see whether that's going to be the case, and I'll just leave it in the pay-to-win section just for novelty for now. But the very next tank, I'm not going to put in the pay-to-win section for novelty, because this is the Projeto 46, and this thing is a godlike tier 8 premium medium tank. I love this vehicle. It's an auto-reloader, and so you can reload your shells one by one by one, and you can strategically unload them on your opponent. This tank inside the frontline game mode is absolutely wild. If you just want to have some fun, go and put yourself Inspire on this tank. Get yourself a premium consumable, Brothers in Arms, all of the min-maxing of this tank, and hit that Inspire, and you will feel just how wild this tank is. You will be able to burst off shells, and because of the increased cruise skill, you can manage to recoup them again. It really allows you to be a super flexible all-rounder that can have a profound impact on the battle. But let's not talk about frontline, let's talk about the random queue. I just think this thing's great. I love this tank's mobility, I love this tank's view range, I love this tank's gun depression, I love this tank's accuracy, its aim time, the fact that it has an auto-reloader. Everything about this tank is what you would want it to be, an all-round great performer, and I'd say that this is probably the holistic medium tank in the game for me, and definitely one of my favorite picks currently. Now let's talk about the STA2. This is an interesting one for me, because for a pay-to-win player out there, it could be a decent choice. This thing has shockingly good premium ammunition, 275mm of heat pen, with enough gun depression and a decent rate of fire to be able to use it as well. However, the problem is that it has a weak point on top. Well, actually, it doesn't matter if it has a weak cupola on top, because the whole of this thing's armor is absolutely tragic. And so everybody is going to pen you. You don't really have incredible alpha or the best damage per minute inside this tank, and it doesn't really make up for it. And so I'm dropping this thing in at a void. And I don't think it'll be too long until Wargaming try to put some kind of a hydropneumatic Japanese medium tank in the game, a little bit like the STB-1, but we'll have to see if that's going to be the case. Alright, so now let's take a look at the only Polish tier 8 premium tank inside the game. It's the 50TP prototype, and I'm going to be dropping this thing either probably in the great performers section. It's a great vehicle. It's got 8 degrees of gun depression, 440 alpha damage. You can hide that lower plate, expose your upper hull, and you don't really have too much of a weak point on top of the tank. This thing is as solid can be, and the only thing that stops me from dropping it in the super competitive section is because there might be another tier 8 premium heavy tank with 440 alpha damage that kind of pulls it back a little bit. Alright, so now one of the most bizarre tanks in this list. It's the Stridsvagn S1. This thing is not the mobile sniper that the UDES is inside the regular Swedish tech tree, but it has way better armor. Now, it doesn't look like it should have good armor on paper. Its armor is only 30mm thick, but it is incredibly well angled. What this means is the S1's armor is very capable against all ammunition that is 90mm in caliber and less. The problem with the tank is that as soon as it is getting engaged by anything that has 91mm in caliber, it's going to overmatch it. And so this vehicle is probably one that I would recommend to avoid unless you're an advanced player, if you want to depend on the armor of this tank, because you will need to know what the caliber is of the gun that the opponent is using, and not just the penetration of the gun, if you want to be able to avoid damage. Are they firing heat? Your armor doesn't work. Do they have a 91mm caliber gun? Your armor doesn't work. And trust me, there's a lot of tanks at tier 8 that do have one of those two things. However, the thing that the tank does do well is just absolutely obliterate people with 288mm of penetration. If you utterly, absolutely don't want to ever fire a premium shell in World of Tanks, then this might be the tank for you, because it has the best standard penetration of any tier 8 premium vehicle. And when you combine it with a decent crew, you can make up for the 350 meters view range, and then you can start to get the DPM going. One thing that's nice about this tank as well is it's limited to 8 kilometers an hour inside the siege mode, and so that allows you to be a lot more mobile than a UDES. And so if you absolutely hate the UDES because it's a sniper, but you enjoy the Stridsvagn 103B or the Stridsvagn 1030 at tier 9, definitely try those tanks out before you buy this. If you're making your way up the Swedish tank destroyer tree and you think, oh, I've got 30 pounds burning a hole in my pocket, I just want to play those Stridsvagns now, don't do it. At least do yourself the service of going to tier 9 and going to tier 10, seeing if you enjoy those vehicles, because if you don't, you're not going to enjoy this tank either. Now let's talk about the Primo Victoria. It was a vehicle that was just flat out better than the regular Centurion in the tech tree. The problem is that its hull is gigantic and very weakly armored. Accordingly, I would recommend to avoid this one. It doesn't really feel like a solid premium tank. And really, the Swedish premium medium tank that I would recommend that you go for is the Lansen. I want to drop the Lansen inside the Great Performers section for a variety of reasons. Firstly, alpha damage. Not many tier 8 premium tanks have 320 alpha damage. To combine that with a decent enough rate of fire, good mobility, actually incredible mobility that the vehicle has with a power to weight ratio of over 28 and 10 degrees of gun depression, and this thing can trade well with its opponents. The only thing that holds this tank back is its armor is pretty tragic, although it will pull off some bounces occasionally, and the fact that its penetration is just lackluster and you won't really be able to engage those tier 9 and tier 10 tanks effectively. But hopefully you're going to be using some of the mobility that the tank has and its ridgeline capacity to be able to outflank them. Alright, so now the Amil 1951. Now I really enjoy this tank. For me, I would actually put this thing inside the super competitive section. However, I understand that not everybody loves those auto-loading Swedish heavy tanks, and so instead I want to drop this thing into the Great Performers. Because while the Amil will be absolutely incredible for you when you spawn in on a map like Overlord and you get to use the fabulous 12 degrees of gun depression that this vehicle has to deliver 1080 damage within 5.5 seconds of the first shot, and you're probably going to be laughing your butt off while you're bouncing them left, right and center with incredible turret armor, and even the hull armor on this vehicle is not tragic like it used to be on the standard Amil. There will be other times where they catch your side. There'll be other times where you just don't have the damage per minute to be able to fight back, or even you'll have to sit still to be able to activate your binoculars, or you're never really going to have good view range inside this tank. The Amil is one of those vehicles that when it's in the right situation, it's absolutely god tier. But there aren't that many maps where you can guarantee that you're going to get it into the correct scenario. Now let's talk about the Senlak, and I would probably want to put this thing in the avoid section, but I'm actually going to drop it in the alright situational area. Now the reason for that is because if you are playing the British light tanks and you want to get a premium light tank to be able to train up your crew, firstly it's your only choice. And secondly, when you actually review the statistics of this tank, it's pretty darn good. Incredible damage per minute, some of the best high explosive rounds in the game, whopping up the damage to over 3,000 with 90mm of penetration, 400 meters view range, which means you're going to spot your opponents, and a decent enough mobility. The only thing that really holds this tank back is that it is a rather large vehicle. It doesn't have the best camo, although you can make up for that with crew skills. And I really think that this is one of the most underrated tanks, but I think it also has sold incredibly badly because of the lackluster performance of the British light tanks, and so not many exceptional players are playing it, and only truly dedicated British light tank players are. Alright, so now on to the FV4 202. Ooh, I'd put this one in the decent choices. Well, it has to be, right? It used to be a tank that was a tier 10 regular vehicle inside the game. The FV4 202 has more than enough penetration to be able to consistently go through its opponents with its standard ammunition. It has 226mm of pen. When you add this with 10 degrees of gun depression and very decent turret armor, if you are using your gun depression, because if you're not, the turret armor is actually pretty horrific on this tank. And yeah, you're going to be an absolute god of a ridgeline. The two things that hold this tank back are the damage per minute and the alpha damage. 230 doesn't really feel exceptional, and 1,725 damage per minute means that you quite often just can't kill your opponents quick enough to be able to win the battle. Okay, next let's talk about a very rare tank inside the game because it was a Clan Wars reward vehicle. It is the Chieftain Slash T95. Not a lot of people got this tank. And hats off to Wargaming for actually releasing a reward vehicle for Clan Wars players that wasn't just crazy OP and we don't see consistently tearing up the matchmaker. And that is because really the armor on this vehicle doesn't kind of feel like a Chieftain. If this thing didn't have a huge weak point on top of the vehicle, its turret armor would be truly epic. The problem is that it does have a huge weak point. Its lower plate is big and fat and even has side weaknesses if it tries to side scrape around corners. Combine this with a very lackluster gun and 380 meters of view range, and this tank is definitely going into the avoid section for me, because how can you pay for a tank that you can't actually pay for to get? But if this thing goes out for bonds, unless you have infinite numbers of bonds, then I would not recommend picking up this tank. Alright, so now on to the Carnarvon Action 10. I think this thing's solid. It's a decent choice. It's got a nice 20 pounder, a lot like you had on the FV4202, but unlike the FV4202, you actually have a really good rate of fire. This thing has one of the best damage per minutes of any tier 8 premium tank, let alone being a heavy tank. 2,338 base is absolutely awesome. And while the vehicle isn't the fastest, it has decent armor to be able to go with that. And it's going to be quite hard for your opponents to be able to pen this thing reliably. If you're not angling, its turret is solid. If you're using your gun depression, its turret is really nice. And with some space protection over the side, it really helps for when you're turning your turret away from your opponents to be able to shoot their enemy or their ally, who's hopefully a one-shot for you. And you avoid taking the damage in the side of the turret more often than not. This thing is pretty much like a Super Conqueror at tier 8. The problem is that it isn't godlike tier for tier like a Super Conqueror is. But as with a lot of the premium tanks in this comparison, if you're looking for a British premium heavy tank trainer, it's still a decent choice, considering that it's probably your only one. Okay, so now on to the Centurion 5-1, and this is pretty much just a better Centurion tank. And while in theory this would mean that I have to drop it in the pay-to-win section, that's not kind of how a tier list works, right? The problem with the Centurion 5-1 is it is a better version of a very poor tier 8 standard tank, and accordingly it's got to drop into the decent choices for me. I think there are better premium vehicles for you to play out there, but if you absolutely love your British premium medium tanks, then you're going to have a toss-up between the FV4202 or the Centurion 5-1 for here. Neither is the better vehicle, but I think if you absolutely love your Centurions, you're probably going to do better with the 5-1 than you would do for the FV4202. Okay, so now on to the Chimera, a reward vehicle inside the game, and I think this one probably also has to go into the decent choices section. The thing that holds this tank back is not the alpha damage at 440. It's absolutely incredible. The thing that holds this thing back is the gun handling that makes the tank feel as if you're playing a heavy tank. And my question is, if you want to play a heavy tank, why don't you just play a heavy tank and not play a heavy tank that has a big old square turret with a weak point on top that is very, very cumbersome indeed? The Chimera just never truly feels like it fits its groove, but again, I think it's actually a reward vehicle done right because it's not crazy OP. It's still a very solid tank. It's a decent tank, and hats off to Wargaming for putting more reward vehicles inside the game which are novel but not just flat out OP and allow the better players to just be the best. Now onto the Turtle, and if there's one thing I've figured out about premium tanks and armor, that is that premium tanks with very good armor actually have very big impacts inside the game. You'll be surprised how forgiving something is and how easy armor is to forget about when you've played World of Tanks a little bit too long and you're just looking at raw stats. You can brush over the armor, try and focus on the DPM, try and focus on the autoloading capacity. The Turtle forgets all of that, has a solid gun, solid DPM, and just frontal focused. It's a real simple ideology vehicle, huge DPM, huge frontal armor, really hard to be able to pen reliably for your opponents, especially if you're using the gun depression of the tank, and because of that, this thing is incredibly solid. The only thing that's stopping me from putting this thing in the super competitive section is that it's just not quite as flexible, and it also has one specific competitor that has not quite made it onto this list yet. Alright, so now let's talk about the T25 Pilot. For a new player, I'd probably drop this in the avoid section. However, I'm going to put it in the alright and situational area. And that is because this is effectively an American medium tank that drops its armor to be able to gain some extra gun capabilities. The problem is it doesn't really gain quite enough gun capabilities, and there are better premium medium tanks inside the game. Alright, so now onto the Chrysler. I guess again, alright situational. It's a really good side scraper. This 105mm can be a performer. Its turret armor is awesome. Problem is, its lower plate is fallible, its side armor is horrific, and while the vehicle is definitely mobile, I just don't think the vehicle can quite compete with other heavy tanks. Alright, now the Patriot, and this is a bizarre tank for me. It definitely can't go lower than decent choices. It's just whether I want to put it in the great performers or the super competitive section. Probably actually I want to drop this in the great performers because I think the Patriot is probably one of the most underrated heavy tanks in the game. It's fast, it's got damage per minute, it has APCR rounds as standard with okay shell velocity, it's not special. The main thing that this tank has is a complete lack of weak point on the turret. Sure, there's a tiny little cupola for people to be able to hit, but even that has 214 millimeters. And apart from that, this thing is a solid turret. It's fast, you just keep moving. And even its hull armor is going to be able to brush aside tier 6 and tier 7 tanks. Get on a ridgeline, get hull down, and get dominating. That's what the Patriot is all about. And spread some freedom while you're at it. I still think this thing is absolutely awesome. But it's really close about whether this thing goes in the decent choices or the great performers section. I'm going to leave it in the great performers section because I think you'd be crazy if you can't do well in this tank. All right, so the TS5, where is this thing going to go? Well, it's going to go in the pay to win section. This is the best tank destroyer at tier 8 in the game. It's incredibly solid. When this thing first went into the game, I thought it was very good, but I did not anticipate how important armor is. This is something that time and time again I keep underestimating, but the statistics don't lie, and the TS5 is an utter beast. I'm sure that a lot of you will be questioning, why did you put the Turtle in the Great Performer section and the TS5 in the Pay to Win section? Well, even though the Turtle has by far the more flexible gun with more gun depression and a big wider gun arc, there are two things that the TS5 have over the Turtle. One is a much better top speed limit. 26 forwards and 12 backwards is way better than 20 forwards and 10 backwards that the Turtle has. But secondly, and this is the killer one, the fact that the Turtle, with even premium rounds, has 253 millimeters of pen, it just sometimes can't quite deal what it needs to do to its opponents. The TS5, on the other hand, has 248 on its standard rounds and 300 on its premium rounds, and that just makes this vehicle so much more dangerous. While the Turtle is going to do better at sniping, and the TS5, once again, it's bizarre, right? We keep seeing these tanks that Wargaming try to make the worst snipers in the game by giving them bad dispersion values. 0.44 looks absolutely horrific, right? But they still end up on top. It's almost as if this dispersion value doesn't really matter as much in World of Tanks as Wargaming think it does. But probably the main reason why I really enjoy the TS5 is that its armor is just so much more simple to use than the Turtle. If the Turtle gets caught out in the open, its lower plate is horrific. This thing is much easier to track than the TS5 as well, as its tracks come over the side of the tank. For the TS5, quite often as you come around the corner, your opponents are going to shoot you in the tracks. They don't damage you like they would do in the Turtle because you have your weak side armor behind the tracks, and then you can laugh at them as you repair and you deliver 400 alpha damage, not 400 rounds, that would be impressive. A 400 alpha damage shot, and then you're most likely going to reload before they will with your still incredible rate of fire that the tank has. Sure, it's not quite as much as the Turtle is, but it's more than enough to be able to just make this tank incredibly solid, and I think it is the best premium Tier 8 tank destroyer, and probably just the best Tier 8 tank destroyer, bar none, inside the game. Next up, let's talk about the M54 E2 Renegade. This thing's a great performer. It really is. It does have a weak point on top of the tank, but it's very fast. It's also got some damage per minute, allows it to get into position, just grind your opponents out. I've been having really good games in this tank on my free-to-play account. I think the only thing that stops this vehicle from going up into the super competitive section is just that weak point on top of the vehicle, and the fact that your side armor is also quite a large profile. Now onto the offspring tank, the TL1 LPC. Oh, it's right between the great performers and the decent choices for me. Oh, I'll probably drop this thing in the decent choices instead of the great performers, as I think there are better premium tanks out there with a more novel playstyle. Nevertheless, this thing hits hard. Wargaming for some reason decided to give it 280 alpha damage, and also incredible heat penetration at 280. And funnily enough, I believe the shell velocity actually gets faster as you change from armor piercing to high explosive anti-tank, which is a bit of a weird one inside World of Tanks. I guess the best thing about this tank is that you do get that offspring crew with the unique voice acting. You can even even play special music inside the game. So if you're the #1 Offspring fan, then this is probably going to go up into the super competitive or pay to win section, right? Or the pay to have fun section in that case. For me, however, I'll drop it in the decent choices. It's not a bad tank, but not a great tank. All right, T34. This one's going to be a bit controversial. I think the T34 is probably going to drop in the alright situational. It might even go into the decent choices section. That's because I really like this tank. What's not to like about 400 alpha damage, 10 degrees of gun depression, and decent turret armor? Wargaming also buffed the view range of this vehicle so it's no longer tragic and you're occasionally going to be able to spot for yourself. This is one of those tanks that is old faithful, it's dependable, and if you get very frustrated inside your tier 9 and tier 10 games, let loose a little bit of that 2 key, dab it, and you're going to have a ridiculous amount of penetration that will make even the tier 9 and tier 10 tanks wince on the enemy team. Now onto the Mutant. I mean, this is a weird one because inside a really good matchup, considering the tank has preferential matchmaking, it does get good matchups occasionally. It might go into the situational section, but for me personally, I'm going to put this in the pay to lose section. Do you know why? Because when I purchased this tank, which was on April Fool's Day, it was available for 1 day only. And when I paid to get this tank. I didn't really need it. I didn't really want it. I paid to be able to get it, to do a review on it for all of you. And it was just such a disappointment. I played it, and outside of having a really good matchup where you expect your tier 8 heavies to do well, it just really floundered around. It was horrific, a huge tank with an awful profile. And more importantly, this tank should have never been sold. This tank was meant for everybody who pre-purchased World of Tanks back in 2010. People who literally said, this game, it's not popular yet, but I like it. Here's $100 Wargaming, and they purchased their biggest package of gold at the start and they got this tank for free. The fact that Wargaming basically belittled the sense of trust that their original customers had in them by re-releasing this tank many years later means it's definitely a tank that I'm ashamed to have inside my garage. So now onto the Super Pershing. Whoa, it's alright in a situation. The Super Pershing, it's definitely not my kind of tank. It's a tank that tries again to be a bit of a hybrid. It's not a medium, it's not a heavy tank. It's got some nice spaced armor, but it does have a big weak point here that you can shoot. If your opponents are knowledgeable, you're going to lose your hit points fairly quickly. And the tank just doesn't really have that gun capacity to be able to make up for it. In addition to that, you have to dab the 2 key a lot in this tank to remain competitive inside the game, and so you quite often find yourself eating into the whole reason why you're probably playing a premium tank, i.e. to make some credits. Now let's talk about the T95 E2. This is a funny one because it's a reward vehicle, it's not a premium tank, and so I can't put it in the pay to lose section, but I'm going to put it in the avoid section. It's just a bit of a nothing tank, boys and girls. There's nothing really to enjoy about this vehicle. It has, again, a bit of a weak point on top, a lot like on the 59 pattern. And there's just nothing really to enjoy. Sure, its armor can be okay in some situations, but everybody's going to shoot that big weak point on top of the tank. It doesn't have an incredible gun, incredible aim time, accuracy, incredible anything. There's nothing really to enjoy about this vehicle. The only thing that there is to enjoy is that I think you can get this tank for free in Wargaming's referral system, although I'm out of date on that, and so it might no longer be the case. Next up, let's talk about the T92 Light tank. I'm going to put it in the alright situational section. Again, it's a vehicle that it's kind of a scout, but it just doesn't have the speed that a pure scout needs. The fact that this tank is limited to 60 kilometers an hour just means that you can't get to the places as fast as other godlike premium light tanks can. And while the vehicle has incredible dispersion values, which probably means that you can drop out the vertical stabilizers on this tank, on the other hand, you really can't because you only have 150 alpha damage. That really is what holds this vehicle back, and you're quite often going to have to just be sitting still with its good rate of fire of 13 to fully utilize the mediocre damage per minute of 2000. And when you sit still in your light tanks, artillery will hit you, people will trade effectively with you, and it just doesn't quite work out nice for the vehicle. To be effective in this vehicle, you have to be stationary, and if you're stationary, you're vulnerable. And combine that with some of the worst penetration for any tier 8 light tank, that makes this one quite a tricky vehicle to recommend, especially for a new player. It's a specialist tank. Some players are going to do well in this. Most players are going to do badly in this. All right, so now on to the ISU 130. Definitely a tank that I would avoid, boys and girls. It does have an absolutely wild damage per minute of 2,854, and it's a very bizarre vehicle because you can actually load premium rounds to have less penetration to have one of the highest damage per minutes in World of Tanks. The problem is it's a glass cannon. The tank's armor is positively mediocre. The penetration is abysmal. 215 on your standard rounds, 187 on your premium rounds. This tank is the definition of a glass cannon. The problem is that there are other better glass cannons in the game, and while I personally want to drop this in the pay to lose section, I'll probably put it in the avoid section purely because there are some scenarios where the thing can be absolutely monstrous. Alright, so now on to the T54 Mod 1, or the first prototype, whatever you want to call it. I really like this tank. I thought it was powerful before Wargaming buffed it, before they gave it a good power to weight ratio, before they gave it 380 meters view range, before they improved the aim time of the vehicle. Now it's just a really solid tank. If you want to kind of get a feeling of an Object 430U and how that vehicle plays, if you get one of these into a nice matchup, it really is very similar playstyle. It's an incredibly solid tank. The problem with the vehicle is that sometimes its turret armor falls, especially when your opponents are auto-aiming at you and they shoot to the left or the right, and its armor definitely isn't godlike. If your opponents get into close quarters combat and aim down on your upper hull, and they will do as this is quite a low-profile tank, it's definitely going to falter. But still, I think this is a solid tank. I'm going to put it in a decent choices section, as there's really nothing that you can hate about this vehicle. Next up, another Clan Wars reward tank. It is the IS-5. And this thing probably used to be in the it probably still is in the great performer section. This thing's an absolute monster with regards to its armor. Take a look at this, boys and girls. It gets standard APCR rounds of 221mm, and the whole of its upper hull is kind of like an IS-7, literally at tier 8. If you can hide your lower plate in this tank, nothing's going to pen you at all, and they're going to have to get lucky to be able to hit the weak point on top of the vehicle. And if you do see one of these on the battlefield, and they are quite a rare sight, you can take advantage of the fact that you can overmatch the forehead of the vehicle here if you can try and get above the vehicle. The tank's just a solid performer. It's got a good power to weight ratio, a good top speed limit, good armor, APCR is standard, and heat rounds. It's a decent tank. But the problem is that it's just not an incredible vehicle these days like it used to be. Now let's talk about the IS-3A. This thing, I think it's going to drop into the super competitive section once again. This thing's a monster. Sorry, nearly knocked over my glass there. That would have been an absolute disaster. The IS-3A deals 390 damage, and it carries 3 rounds in its auto-reloading magazine. And bizarrely enough, this tank's damage per minute actually gets higher as it reloads faster as it progressively unloads shells. And so it comes around the corner, it unloads its 3 rounds, it deals 1,170 damage to you, and then it reloads its additional shot faster than if it hadn't fired, if it had all of its shells ready. The mind boggles. Reverse auto reloader, premium tank. It's an incredible vehicle. And the jury's out about whether this tank is going to be better than the double barrel in the long run. I'm thinking it might be the case. Alright, so now let's talk about the T44-100. This thing's a decent choice. All I can say is that it's probably the most well-rounded premium tank. If you can't do well in this vehicle, then there's something wrong with your playstyle at tier 8. However, the fact that it's so well-rounded kind of means that some of the statistics of the vehicles haven't been skewed quite as far as to give it a huge advantage against on a specific map, or will allow an experienced player to be able to use that huge advantage like some of the great performers or the super competitive or the pay-to-win tanks have. And so it's quite interesting that its well-rounded nature also holds the vehicle back from plunging up the charts. But actually, in retrospect, thinking about it now, I can't leave this thing in the decent choices. It has to be in a great performer section. It's almost pushing up into the super competitive section. I mean, come on, it's Soviet, right? So now the KV-4 KTTS. Sorry, I mean the Kozlovsky. The KTTS is a tank destroyer that has yet to be released. The Kozlovsky is a bizarre vehicle. It's a rear-mounted turret, but this tank, just the way that it gets around is like a complete slug. 30 kilometers an hour top speed limit, 13 power to weight ratio. The only thing that kind of makes up for this is its great reverse speed of 16 kilometers an hour, which allows the vehicle to side scrape. Yeah, you know what? If this tank side scrapes, it's great. But the off-center gun means it's actually better at side scraping around this corner than it would be around the other corner. The problem with the vehicle is that if you side scrape around this corner, the tank's awesome because they can't hit your cupola. However, let's say you want to side scrape around the other corner. Now you have to expose far too much of your hull, and also they can shoot the weak point on top of the tank. This thing is the definition of a one-trick pony. And so if they ever make this thing available for bonds, or if they ever make this thing available for gold or for money, I would firmly put this thing in the avoid section. Alright, so ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, the one that a lot of you have been waiting for. It's the Defender, and yeah, this thing's got to go up into the pay-to-win section. Look, while the tank isn't as competitive in the game now as it was when it first went into the game, this tank was the definition of the start of complete pay-to-win inside World of Tanks. It was the snowball that has now turned into an avalanche of Wargaming just releasing more and more powerful premium tanks, which are pushing so many people away from the game. The Defender is so powerful that it actually has an average win ratio of nearly 54%. That's completely outrageous. It's a whole percentage or even 2 percentage points clear of all of the other vehicles inside the game, and hopefully Wargaming realize this and they stop selling the tank for good. Accordingly, if you ever see Wargaming sell this thing, don't feel guilty if you want to purchase it. I can't blame you. While your purchase will effectively fund Wargaming's desire for greed to release overpowered tanks that inevitably will make the game worse, I can't blame you, because why wouldn't you want to get the most bang for your buck? And this tank will give you that. 6 degrees of gun depression, 440 alpha, and hull armor that literally people just have to load the gold to even have a 50-50 chance of penetrating. What more is there to say about the Defender, boys and girls? Alright, so now on to an absolute bizarre tank, the T103. This is something you won't see a lot of because, frankly, not a lot of them sold. People purchased these things, played a couple games in them, thought, it's alright, and then never really played it again. You don't see these things on the battlefield, even though it's got 180 degrees of turret traverse to the left and 180 degrees of turret traverse to the right, aka a fully traversable turret, in other words, right? And also 8 degrees of gun depression with big boy alpha damage. This thing packs a wallop. 440 is very nice indeed, and its premium pen is 307. This thing was Wargaming trying to make a Soviet Scorpion. The problem was, nobody bought it. And so they just really then had to think about what could they make next, right? This thing goes into the alright situational section for me because it's just such a big, cumbersome tank that has terrible camera rating, but it can surprise opponents because there's just so few of them on the battlefield. And so maybe if you want to be a little bit of a hipster, pick one up and shock them. But really, Wargaming missed it with this thing, and so they had to bring out the SU-130 PM, which was pretty much as close to Wargaming releasing a Soviet Scorpion, one of the most sold tanks of all time, as they possibly could. So how does the tank compare to the Scorpion? Because clearly that's going to be its competition. Well, it's faster at 65 kilometers an hour, with a better effective traverse speed, higher alpha damage at 520. Yeah, Wargaming had to just make it pip the Scorpion, right? But more importantly, it has special heat rounds with 320 millimeters of penetration. That's one of, if not the highest penetrating rounds of any premium tank inside the game. And considering that this vehicle has a semi-traversable turret, it can traverse 77 degrees to the left and 77 degrees to the right. Yeah, this thing's a performer. It's also got incredibly good camera rating, and you can't really go wrong with this tank. Accordingly, I think it's a real toss-up of whether this thing goes into the super competitive or the great performer section, but I think I'm going to drop it in the super competitive section, because while it can't traverse its turret behind itself while it's running away from its opponents like the Scorpion can, quite often it can sneak out undetected, unlike the larger German vehicle will. And so if I personally had a choice of either playing the Scorpion or playing the SU-130 PM, I'd pick the SU-130 PM at least most days of the week. Now let's talk about the STG Guard. This is a medium tank with 122mm main armament that deals 390 damage. It's also one of the most accurate vehicles with such a large alpha damage. It has a decent mobility, okay armor, and a fully traversable turret. It's a decent choice. The problem is the tank is just not exceptional in any way apart from its alpha damage, and I think there are better premium vehicles to choose inside the game. Now let's talk about the LT432, and yeah, is there any doubt that this thing's going to be in the pay-to-win section? This is, in my opinion, the best premium light tank and the best tier 8 light tank available. I think it's actually probably a little bit better than the EBR, holistically, but the EBR can be truly exceptional and do things that the LT432 can't on maps like Prokhorovka. That's not saying that you can't still do very well indeed with the LT432 on Prokhorovka. The thing that's outrageous about this tank is that it just has far too much gun depression. I'm completely confused as to how this tank, this pancake of a tank, look at this tiny, short vehicle, can have 7 degrees of gun depression. To me, it looks like the gun should be going through the roof, but it just doesn't. So I guess that the barrel kind of stops about here or something. I guess that's what happens with the vehicle. Combine that with decent armor, 70mm at the front, 40 at the sides, and 160 on the turret, and yet you're going to be able to ricochet people on your turret quite often. So what basically happens is this is a light tank with regards to its speed, 70 kilometers an hour and 23, with a very good power to weight ratio of 33, that can get to a ridgeline and then just work its armor against its opponent. It goes forwards, backwards. It's an incredibly hard tank to hit. It has incredible dispersion values and an okay damage per minute. This thing's a monster. This thing inside the front line game mode is only held back by its penetration, but you can still make it work by closing the distance or aiming at weak points at your opponents. This thing really is one of the UFOs of World of Tanks, and if you like your Soviet light tanks like the T100 LT and the LT432, is definitely not going to disappoint you inside the game. Alright, so now let's talk about the latest premium heavy tank and the game changer, the Object 703 with its double barrel gun. This is an interesting one. I think this vehicle is going to be pay to win for the best players, because what an experienced player can do with a double barrel shots is absolutely incredible. However, I think for a different kind of player, it's probably either going to be a great performer or even a decent choice, and I think you'll be better with an IS-3A. And so I'm going to be dropping this tank probably in the super competitive section, as it kind of balances out for the holistic player. This thing's armor is incredible, and its alpha damage of when it combines its double shot, 780, is just monstrous. There's no other premium tank that can deliver such a large blow. But also, the possibility for disaster in this tank is truly as tremendous as the alpha damage that it will inflict. If you mess up your double shot, or if you don't think about coming around the corner enough and you put one of your barrels into the wall because you haven't mastered the fact that you will be looking at one of your barrels, but you also have to deliver the other barrel, it can just be a complete disaster for the tank. And the big boom that erupts from the Object 703 as it does so will alert your enemies to, okay, it's go time. I've got about 20-30 seconds where he can only do about 390 damage to me. Hopefully I can remove all of his in that time. The interesting thing about the Object 703 is Wargaming clearly didn't want it to be played like an auto-reloader. It's just a lot of people are playing it like an auto-reloader. And who would have thought, if you give a tank decent mobility, very decent armor, and a 390 alpha damage gun with incredible hidden statistics, amazing dispersion values on this tank. In fact, I'll show you just how good the dispersion values are on this tank, as they are hidden away, and quite often you won't get to see them inside the game. Look at this, 0.06 dispersion when turning the turret. That's kind of tier 10 worthy. That's why this vehicle doesn't bloom when you're holding down the mouse and you're delivering that double barrel shot. The only thing that prevents this vehicle from being completely godlike is its worst in class aim time, worst in class accuracy, and the fact that its damage per minute is definitely not incredible, in addition to poor view range and 5 degrees of gun depression. If any of those things changed, then this would be going firmly into the pay to win section. The jury's still out on this tank. I still need a little bit more time to play it. I still need a little bit more time to see how the player base plays it, but there's one thing for sure. It's a winner. It's at least super competitive. You can't go wrong with this vehicle. All right, so now we've talked about the latest premium tank in the game. Let's talk about the KV-5, which was the original Tier 8 premium Soviet heavy tank inside the game. It was such good value at 7,500 gold that Wargaming actually removed it because I guess they wanted to try and elevate the price, and it was directly competing with their new premium tanks that went in. They bring the KV-5 back occasionally, and I'd put it in the alright situational section because while it has good DPM, its armor has been buffed, its penetration has been buffed, which used to be one of the weakest things about the tank, its armor still just doesn't hold up enough to be able to justify it being higher up on this list. And finally, let's talk about the IS-6. Now, when the IS-6 first went into the game, it was probably my go-to tank for just being an all-rounder. It had armor, it had a fairly good rate of fire. I always felt like I had a chance in this tank with its preferential matchmaking. Oh, how times have changed, right, boys and girls? And consequently, the IS-6 probably drops down into the alright situational section, just like the KV-5 does. Because when you get yourself into those magical Tier 6 and Tier 7 games, you're still going to be doing well in the IS-6. That's not to say that you can't do pretty well against your Tier 8s and Tier 9 opponents as well, but just like with a lot of the other tanks that you see down this list, which are some of the older premium tanks in the game. They just don't hold up in the new meta of World of Tanks. And so, woo, there you have it, ladies and gents. I think this will be my longest video of all time. I feel like I've been talking all day. And so, woo, ladies and gents, that was my rating of every single tier 8 premium tank that Wargaming have ever released inside the game. I can tell you what, there's quite a lot of them. If you think about each of one of these costing you £30, I don't want to think about how much money I've spent on World of Tanks, right? But hopefully, this list allows you to invest your money more wisely. That's the whole purpose of what my YouTube channel is all about. If you think the list will, or you just enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up. But if you hated it, give it a thumbs down. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to the comments of this one, just like I was for my tier 10 tier list, as I'm sure that a lot of you, and I want you to, let me know if you think there are any tanks that I've put in the wrong places, or do you completely agree with me on every decision that I've made. And as always, thank you so much for watching. You've been epic, and hopefully I'll see you soon.